Fear was not a metaphor. Fear was a technology. And on the winter morning when folder number 17 was opened in the vault on Lubyanka, that technology suddenly turned against its own architect. The safe stood in the corner of the office like a second mute body, heavy, gray, unblinking. For years, nobody touched it without a signature, a second key, a call upstairs. On that morning, there was no one upstairs to call. The man whose name sealed the door was lying in a marble hall beneath a red flag and an ocean of chrysanthemums. The state was preparing to bury him with hymns and salutes. The system he had built was not ready to bury him at all. The locksmith from the 9th Directorate did not know whose safe he was opening. He only knew it was urgent and by order of the Central Committee, and words that in this building were more powerful than any rank. His hands shook slightly as he turned the discs, listening to the dry clicks of the tumblers. Behind him, 2 generals watched in silence, their faces expressionless, as if engraved by decades of secrecy. They had both spent their lives learning how to keep doors closed. Today, their task was the opposite. The last click sounded louder than a gunshot. The door yielded a few centimeters and exhaled a breath of stale metal and paper. Inside, everything was frighteningly neat. No cash envelopes, no gold, no foreign watches, none of the cheap trophies so common in the safes of lesser officials. Only rows of brown, identical folders, each with a number written in a careful, slightly old-fashioned hand. "Take them out in order," one of the generals said, though nobody had asked. The locksmith stepped aside, suddenly feeling as if he had invaded a private bedroom. The younger colonel, who had been standing by the wall, moved forward and began to lift the folders, one by one, as if they might explode. Number 1, number 2, number 3. They made a small stack on the polished table. The air in the office grew heavy, dense with dust and unspoken memories. Outside the window, Moscow was wrapped in funeral sound, distant sirens, motorcades, the slow wail of official mourning on the radio. Inside, there was only the rustle of cardboard and the squeak of rubber gloves rubbing against paper. When they reached folder number 17, the older general raised his hand. "Stop here," he said quietly. He pronounced the number as if it were a date of a disaster. The colonel obeyed. Folder number 17 looked exactly like the others. Standard format, state seal in the corner, the same careful handwriting. Only one detail was different. On the spine next to the number, there was a small black dot of ink, almost invisible, a sign for someone who knew what to look for. A warning for those who did not. "Open," the general ordered. The colonel unfastened the metal clasp. For a second he hesitated, feeling the weight of someone else's secrets in his hands. He had spent his career collecting secrets on others. It had never occurred to him that the most dangerous ones could be those of the man who commanded the collectors. The first page was not a report. It was a photograph, a piece of white silk carefully laid out on a neutral background as if for a catalog. Delicate lace, hand-sewn trim, a size and a brand written in neat black ink along the lower margin. Nothing obscene, nothing indecent, and yet the room instantly felt indecent, as if the 3 men had walked uninvited into a stranger's bathroom. The colonel flipped to the next sheet, another photograph. This time a pastel-colored garment, more modest, with a small repair visible along the seam. Again a handwriting annotation, size, price, shop, date of purchase. Below, a line that froze his blood more than any code word. Owner, spouse a comrade, member of the Politburo. He did not read the surname aloud. He did not need to. In this building, certain first letters were enough. The general remained silent, but his jaw tightened. The locksmith shifted his weight and looked at the door, already regretting that he was in the room at all. He had opened safes before. He had seen compromising photographs, access codes, emergency plans. He had never seen this. An archive not of people, but of their most intimate fabric. Page after page, the pattern repeated itself. Photographs of women's underwear, each shot with almost medical precision. Under every image, lines of text. color, material, size, store, date, time, cashier number. Then, inevitably, the last line, owner, followed by titles and surnames that formed a map of the entire country's political summit. 23 wives of 23 men who believed they ruled a sixth of the planet. Any of them could summon a minister, a marshal, a newspaper editor with a single phone call. None of them apparently knew that their drawers were being inventoried in a secret safe a few floors above the prison cells. "This is insane," the colonel whispered before he could stop himself. The older general turned his head slowly. "This," he said, tapping the photograph with a gloved finger, "is not insanity. This is method. This is how he worked. He did not pronounce the dead man's name. In this office, names were rarely pronounced. They existed as portraits on the wall, signatures at the end of decrees, initials on red folders. Still, all three of them knew whose handwriting was on the pages. They recognized the dry, slightly slanted script that had once appeared under orders, changing the fate of whole regions. One folder, the colonel thought. One folder, and already the ground beneath his feet felt different, slippery. 17. If 17 looked like this, what lay in the first 16? What about the rest? He continued to turn the pages, and the photographs began to change. At first, they were simple catalog images. Then appeared traces of movement, a fold, a shadow suggesting a body that had just left the frame. Later, there were discrete glimpses of interior backgrounds, hotel curtains, the chrome edge of a foreign bathtub, corner of a nightstand with a foreign magazine. Under the pictures, the notes grew more detailed, more clinical. Acquired during an unofficial trip to the German Democratic Republic, paid in foreign currency. Observed being worn during a private meeting with citizens such and such at a state dacha outside Moscow. Likely gift from the same individual. It was not pornography, it was cartography. A map of betrayal, vanity, secret desires. Every lace ribbon was a coordinate on that map. Every silk strap was a thread in a web that connected the most guarded bedrooms in the country directly to the office whose safe they had just opened. At the end of the folder, after 73 photographs, there was a short memorandum. Only 3 paragraphs. No official letterhead, no stamps. Just the same dry handwriting, now more compressed, as if the author had been in a hurry. Conclusion, the first line read, "In conditions where public image is more important than private reality, intimate habits become a strategic resource." The colonel felt a chill run down his spine. It was not the sentence itself. It was the realization that in this building, strategic resource never meant just information. It meant leverage, control, the quiet pressure that could end a career without a single shot fired or a single arrest announced. The wives, the memorandum continued, do not have access to state secrets. They have access to something more valuable. The fragile self-image of those who believe they have nothing to fear. The older general looked away as if the words were too bright to stare at directly. On the last page of the folder, there was a final photograph. The colonel saw it, froze, and for a moment thought his heart had simply stopped. Not because the image was different, the same neutral background, the same careful arrangement of fabric, but because of the line underneath. Owner, spouse of comrade. The surname that followed did not belong to a minister or to a member of the Politburo. It belonged to the man lying under the flag, to the architect of the secret himself. For a few seconds, none of them spoke. The office, with its heavy curtains and portraits, shrank to the size of the photograph. It had taken decades to build a system that could reach into every corner of the state, into every apartment, every kitchen, every bed. That system now lay before them, distilled into one obscene paradox. The creator of total control had ended his life under the gaze of a camera pointed at his own home. Only then did the older general, with a slow, almost weary movement, close the folder. "Remember this day, comrade," he said to the colonel, his voice hoarse. "People will tell you that fear is an emotion. They are wrong. Fear's a tool. It can be calibrated, measured, archived, like this. He tapped the cardboard with his knuckle. "But there is always a moment," he added, looking at the safe that still held dozens of other numbered secrets, "when the tool stops being in your hands and you find yourself in its hands instead." Outside, the funeral march on the radio reached its final solemn chord. Inside, under the fluorescent light, 3 men stood around folder number 17, listening not to the music, but to the silent hum of the machine their whole lives had fed. Fear was not a metaphor. Fear was a technology. And that morning on Lubyanka, the technology had quietly announced that it no longer belonged to the one who had designed it. By the summer of 1967, the country believed it knew who controlled its fear. Only a few people understood that the man who had just taken over the Committee for State Security was still learning where the real levers were. It began not in a bunker, but on a dacha veranda that smelled of pine resin and grilled meat. The new chairman was a guest there, officially for an informal meeting, unofficially to measure the temperature of his own future. The host, his predecessor, carried himself like a man who still considered the whole apparatus his backyard. He talked loudly, laughed readily, patted younger officers on the shoulders if they were still his subordinates, not someone else's. Underneath the easy jokes there was tension. When the 2 men stepped aside to talk alone, the laughter in the yard did not follow them. The guards at the gate were standing a little too straight. The drivers smoked in silence, carefully not looking at the house. In that world, a dacha was more than a house. It was a stage where power rehearsed intimacy. Ministers swam in the same cold lake where they whispered about appointments. Generals rebuilt grills and fences while negotiating arrests and promotions. The new chairman understood this better than most. He had spent years in embassies where every dinner was a report and every handshake a calculation. So when the veranda door opened and the host's wife stepped out in a robe cinched too loosely at the waist, he did not see only a woman who had been called suddenly to the table. He saw a mistake. The fabric slid when she leaned forward to pour wine. Just a little, just enough. In another country, it might have been nothing, an awkward moment, a joke, a shared glance. Here, in a system where the personal was more dangerous than the political, it was a crack in the armor. The chairman's eyes did not linger on her. They moved past her to the reaction around the table. One of the generals, a thick-necked man with a reputation for bluntness, looked away so quickly his chair almost scraped back. The host, the former head of the apparatus, pretended not to notice anything at all. His smile froze in a fraction. Too long. Only one man at the table allowed himself a half-second of a different expression. A half-smile, almost invisible, that flickered and vanished. The chairman recognized him. General Stepanov. Old friend of the host. Too old a friend. The moment passed, the robe was adjusted, the conversation resumed, but the chairman's mind did not move on. He did not think in terms of jealousy or morality. He thought in terms of patterns. If the wife of a man who had once controlled the most secret files in the country could allow such a moment in front of a new chairman, it meant the old man had grown careless. If a general at the same table allowed himself that half-smile, it meant that what had just happened was not an accident, but a repetition. Repetition meant habit. Habit meant vulnerability. In a regime built on image, vulnerability was more valuable than loyalty. That night, on the way back to the city, the chairman did not discuss ideology with his aide. He dictated names. "The dacha," he said. "I want full coverage from now on. Discreet, no official reports. Only to my desk." The aide wrote down the address without comment. "And the general," the chairman added after a pause. "Stepanov. I want his movements, not his speeches, not his meetings, his movements." The aide hesitated for a moment. "On what grounds should the surveillance be justified, Comrade Chairman?" he asked carefully. The chairman looked out the car window, watching the dark line of the forest slide by. "On the grounds," he said, "that people are most honest when they believe they are not being watched." It started small. A camera tucked into a birdhouse facing the veranda. A microphone hidden behind a loose panel in the guest bedroom. a rotation schedule for 2 young officers from a never officially formed group who learned to move like gardeners and electricians. The first photographs showed nothing extraordinary. Family lunches, grandchildren, fishing rods leaning against a railing. The chairman did not even smile when he saw them. He merely sorted them into envelopes, wrote dates in his dry handwriting, and filed them in a drawer that his secretary knew not to touch. Weeks passed. The dacha settled back into its summer rhythm. The host continued to speak loudly, to laugh, to invite guests. He joked about his successor, the theorist, who in his view lacked the instinct for real work. He did not know that every relaxed afternoon added a line to a file that did not officially exist. The breakthrough came on a warm evening when the cameras caught nothing at all for hours. No guests, no cars, no movement. Then past midnight, headlights appeared at the gate, not official government plates, a private car. On the grainy film, the gate guard hesitated, then let the vehicle through. The camera in the yard caught only shadows, a figure in civilian clothes, the outline of a coat, a quick step to the side entrance. No host, no lights in the main bedroom. It might have been nothing. An old friend, a relative, a courier. Except that the camera in the hallway, installed only a week earlier, captured a detail the chairman had been waiting for without admitting it to himself. The woman in the robe opened the door. This time there was no robe. The recording did not need to show more than her silhouette to make the truth plain. She embraced the visitor in the darkness. The general's profile was visible for less than a second, lit by the street lamp through the window. It was enough. The report that reached the chairman's desk was not written in the standard language of counterintelligence. No mention of espionage, foreign contacts, or subversive activity. Instead, it read like a household diary with surgical precision. Dates of visits, durations of stays, times when the host was out of town, excuses given to the staff. The chairman went through it with a red pencil. He did not underline the word kiss or embrace, Pierre, where the young officer's embarrassed vocabulary had slipped into the report. He underlined something else, the lines where the wife lied to her husband about her whereabouts, and the lines where the general lied to his own staff about his. In the margins, he wrote only one phrase, by point of entry. In another era, this would have remained a personal tragedy, whispered among servants and ignored by history. In the architecture of this regime, it became a structural element. For 6 months, the chairman did nothing. He did not confront the host. He did not summon the general. He did not leak anything to the rumor mill, which in that city was as powerful as any newspaper. Instead, he continued to collect receipts from a jewelry shop where a necklace paid with unexplained money matched the one seen on the wife's neck the next weekend, an invoice from a car repair garage where the general's vehicle appeared mysteriously every time the husband was on a business trip, telephone logs showing late-night calls from one apartment in the city to another, always cut short if anyone else picked up. Every piece of household compromise, as he began to call it in his own notes, was cataloged and dated. No coarse language, no moral judgment, just a simple, relentless accumulation of evidence that 2 people who believed they were acting in private had built a separate reality inside a system that tolerated only one. When the folder was thick enough to stand by itself on the desk, he called in his most trusted operative, not the loudest, not the bravest, the one who never gossiped. This, the chairman said, pushing the folder toward him, does not exist. The operative nodded. Operative. It will never exist, the chairman continued, until the moment when it must. The operative did not ask what that moment would be. He knew that in this building, moments were manufactured with patience, not passion. The opportunity arrived in the form of a seemingly unrelated conflict. The host, the former chairman, spoke too freely at a central committee meeting, criticizing what he called over-intellectualization of security policy. He mocked the new emphasis on analysis and system. He did not name his successor, but everyone in the hall felt the target. The speech would have passed as one more grumble from an old guard, if not for one thing. The host still had allies. He still had files of his own, favors owed, Men in uniform who would happily remember the times when they had answered to him. The new chairman understood what was at stake. This was not about wounded pride. It was about the possibility that the apparatus might split its loyalty even slightly. In that world, even a small crack could flood the entire structure. He did not answer the speech publicly. He answered it privately with a folder. When the host was invited for a conversation, the room where they met was devoid of microphones. The chairman had insisted on that detail. Fear, he believed, works best when nothing interrupts the sound of someone's own breathing. The folder lay on the table between them, anonymous and brown. "What is this?" the former chairman asked, frowning. "Something you will want to see before you speak again," his successor replied. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply opened the folder to the first photograph and turned it around. The older man's face did not change at first. He was a professional. He had seen bodies, confessions, foreign currency, confiscated letters. But as he turned page after page, the familiar veranda, the silhouette of his wife in the doorway, the profile of his friend stepping across the threshold at midnight, his hand began to tremble almost imperceptibly on the edge of the cardboard. "Who else has seen this?" he asked eventually, his voice quieter. "No one who matters," the chairman answered. "And it will stay that way so long as we agree on one simple thing." "And that is," the other man forced out. "That your time is already past," the chairman said. "You will not gather allies. You will not build a circle. You will not question decisions in public. You will retire with honors, as a man who has chosen to rest. That is the narrative. The other narrative," he added, closing the folder with a soft thud, "never leaves this room." There was a silence then, heavy and strange. For a second, the former chairman seemed about to explode, to throw the folder, to shout, to remind his successor of all the things they both knew about the system, about buried bodies, about secret operations. Instead, he swallowed. In that instant, the new chairman saw something he would never forget. Behind the mask of indignation and hurt, there was something else, a shame so sharp it cut through decades of power. A man who had been feared his entire career, undone not by ideology, not by conspiracy, but by his own household. Half a year later, the retirement was announced as a voluntary decision. Health, fatigue, the desire to spend more time with family, the usual formulas. The newspapers printed photographs of the smiling couple at their dacha. No one mentioned that the dacha was now under new surveillance, controlled from a different office. The general, Stepanov, was transferred to a less influential post in a distant region. Officially, it was a promotion. Unofficially, it was exile. He left without protest. Someone else now held the only script that could explain his departure. In the chairman's private notes, the episode received a title, Lesson of Shilepin. Underneath, he wrote a sentence that would become the quiet blueprint of a new policy. If a state wants to own a man's decisions, he wrote, it must first own his reflection in the mirror of his closest ones. From that moment, the experiment at the dacha ceased to be just an experiment. It became a model. What had begun as a single camera watching a single veranda turned into a question that would reshape the entire apparatus. If the private lives of one family could change the balance of power at the top, what could be done with the private lives of all of them? Years later, men promoted by the new chairman would repeat that phrase in different forms without always remembering where it came from. Reputation is more important than reality, they would say. Fear is not an emotion, it is an instrument. In the summer of 1967, on a veranda outside Moscow, that instrument was forged out of something the regime had long despised as bourgeois triviality: love affairs, jealousy, vanity, fabric. By the time the leaves began to fall, the chairman knew one thing with absolute clarity. The future of control would not be decided only in ministries and meetings. It would be decided in bedrooms and in the small shops where women quietly chose the garments that made them feel alive. By the early 1970s, the experiment on one dacha had become a quiet obsession. The chairman no longer asked whether intimate details could decide careers. He asked why such details were still being collected in an improvised way. Spies followed cars, cameras watched verandas. But there was no system, only episodes. Episodes were useful in duels. He wanted a factory. The key turned out to be not in a secret bunker, but behind the glass of 4 small, closed distribution stores that sold imported lingerie to the wives of very important people. In a country that preached equality, these shops were temples of privilege. Italian lace in a city where most women queued for plain cotton, French silk in a state that lectured about modesty. Access was by list, not by money. To cross their threshold, a woman had to belong to someone who mattered. The order was simple and brilliantly cruel. Cash registers in those 4 shops were replaced with special models that printed 2 receipts for every purchase. One went to the customer. The second, alongside a carbon copy of the handwritten logbook, traveled not to the tax office, but to a small unmarked room where 7 people worked without a sign on the door. They were not listed in any public structure. On paper, they were attached to different departments. In reality, they served only one file cabinet. Their job sounded trivial: record every transaction made by the wives and daughters on the access list, but they were not accountants. They were pattern readers. They noted not only the size and color, but also the timing, the frequency, the sudden changes. A quiet spouse who for years bought the same modest set and suddenly demanded something extravagant was highlighted. A minister's wife whose spending on foreign underwear exceeded her official household budget was flagged. Every anomaly was a hint of a story waiting to be written into a folder. The first major success of this industrialized surveillance came with the case of the Internal Affairs Minister. His wife became one of the most regular clients in the French section. Month after month, she left the shop with carefully wrapped boxes, each purchase recorded twice, once in the cash register, once in the secret notebook. The numbers added up slowly and mercilessly. 200 rubles a month on lingerie in a city where many people lived on less than that. The 7-person unit turned receipts into graphs, graphs into suspicions, suspicions into a discreet shadow that followed her beyond the shop door. The pattern emerged with a clarity no bugged office could have provided. New sets appeared on evenings when the minister traveled. Taxi routes curved away from the official apartment toward the same anonymous building, curtains closed at the same hour. The receipts told the story before any camera did. Someone was dressing for someone else. When the folder on the minister landed on the chairman's desk, it did not contain a single ideological accusation. No foreign agents, no treason, no conspiracies. Only photographs of lace, copies of receipts, timestamps, addresses, and a final analytic note. Subject's public image of moral strictness incompatible with documented private behavior. High potential for managed resignation under pretext of loss of trust. The minister was removed swiftly and almost politely. Ill health, bad management, vague inconsistencies in his department. The usual euphemisms. He was not publicly disgraced. He did not need to be. Everyone at his level understood that in this system, losing a chair without a clear reason was itself a silent verdict. In the secret cabinet, one more folder was placed next to the lesson of Chez Lapin. The method had worked twice. That meant it could be scaled. By the end of the decade, 23 such dossiers existed, each one built from the same raw material. Cash register tapes, boutique notebooks, discreet photographs of shopping bags and doorways. The 7-person group became, without any official recognition, a micro-factory of fear. They did not torture, they did not interrogate, they did not even raise their voices. They simply turned private choices of fabric and color into levers that could move the heaviest chairs in the Politburo hall. The irony was obscene and precise. The agency that was supposed to guard the state from spies now measured the size of undergarments and the rhythm of purchases. But in the chairman's logic, there was nothing ridiculous about it. Tanks and missiles protected borders. These folders protected power. in a system where reputation mattered more than reality. A silk strap was more dangerous than any leaflet, and a receipt from a clothes shop had more explosive force than a gun. What looked from the outside like petty voyeurism was in fact the industrialization of a simple discovery. The most efficient way to control a man who fears nothing is to quietly own the secrets that would make him fear himself. By the mid-70s, the system the chairman had built seemed untouchable. Then, one morning, he unlocked his own safe and found there a photograph that should not have existed. It lay on top of the familiar folders, unnumbered without a cover sheet. The same neutral background, the same careful arrangement of fabric, the same dry annotations in the margin, size, color, store, date. Only the last line differed. Owner, spouse a comrade, followed by his own surname. For a long moment he simply stood there, the door of the safe open. The office suddenly feeling smaller. He recognized the style of the work instantly. It was his method, his template, his logic turned and aimed back at him. No outsider could have staged it. Only someone who knew precisely how his secret apparatus operated could have smuggled this page into the most guarded metal box in the building. The first instinct was denial, a fabrication, an enemy operation, foreign services, but the handwriting was authentic. The shop mentioned was one of his 4. The date matched a day when his wife had said she was visiting a friend. There was no need for foreign agents. The betrayal was domestic. He did not call for guards. He did not raise an alarm. Instead, he closed the safe, sat down at his desk, and for the first time in many years, locked the office door from the inside. The question was not who had followed his wife. The question was who had access to the sealed space between his safe and his fear. The investigation lasted 8 months and left almost no paper trace. He did not trust protocols now. Protocols could be read. He summoned operatives one by one, never the same office twice, asked about technical chains, key holders, code words. He mapped the path of every photograph from the hidden cameras to the secret cabinet. Who developed the film, who printed it, who carried it upstairs. Somewhere along that invisible pipeline, he knew someone had reversed the flow. The answer, when it surfaced, was worse than any foreign plot. At the end of the chain stood a man he had once called a friend. General Tisvigun had shared more than offices with him. They had survived purges together, toasted victories, traded grim jokes about the honor of knowing too much. He was the one person the chairman had allowed into the outer circle of his private project, the only one who knew the full scope of folder number 17 and its sisters. If anyone could have taken one of those methods and mirrored it back, it was him. The proof did not come in the form of a confession. It came as a pattern, as always. A technician quietly admitted that some orders had come from the general directly, bypassing the usual channels. A driver remembered a sealed envelope carried to a private apartment, not to the office. A clerk recalled a set of copies prepared just in case on Svigun's instructions. Thread by thread, the chairman pulled the rope and found his own name tied to the end of it. Confronting him openly would have meant exploding the entire construction. To accuse his deputy, he would have had to explain where the photograph came from, how such photographs were made, why such a file existed at all. He would have had to show his own weapon to the very circle he had been holding at bay with rumors of it. In that sense, he was trapped in the most elegant cage of all, one built from his own secrecy. So they continued to sit at the same meetings. They continued to sign the same orders, exchange the same clipped phrases in corridors. The chairman knew that his deputy could at any moment move the photograph from the safe of blackmail into the light of the plenum hall. The deputy knew that the chairman, if cornered, could do the same to him with other folders. What had once been comradeship turned into a standoff between two men both held hostage by the same mechanism. By the early 80s, the tension hardened into something poisonous. The chairman's health deteriorated. Kidneys, doctor said, stress, age. Stress was not a medical term in his world. It was a tool. He understood too well how it worked, how repeated shocks could wear down a body more surely than any poison. With each new hint that his wife's image was circulating in a small, closed circle around a rival named Chernenko, the shocks multiplied. When the news came in 1982 that General Tisvigun had been found dead, officially a suicide, a revolver, a brief note, it solved nothing and answered everything. On paper, it was a personal tragedy. On the level where folders decided fates, it was an erasure. One of the few men who knew exactly how the system truly functioned was gone, so perhaps was the only person who could have weaponized the photograph in the chairman's own safe. The irony was merciless. A structure designed to make every person replaceable, every official controllable, had ended up devouring the trust between the two men who had understood it best. In a state where everyone feared files, the head of the security service discovered that the most dangerous file was the one that did not need to exist on paper at all, the one stored in the mind of a friend who had quietly become a rival. When he became General Secretary in November 1982, the cameras showed a familiar ritual, the new leader standing on the mausoleum, the party elite aligned like a stone wall at his back, columns of soldiers and rockets rolling below under the gray Moscow sky. The announcer spoke of experience, firm hand, renewal of discipline. The country saw a pale, rigid man who moved carefully but still spoke with authority. Only those who had watched him up close knew that every step up the tribune cost him more than any stormy speech in his youth. His kidneys had been failing for years. Doctors spoke in euphemisms and codes, but the fact was simple. The machine he had devoted his life to serving did not care whether its chief mechanic slept with tubes in his veins at night. Decisions could be signed lying down. Orders could be whispered. In a system where appearances were everything, it was enough to show him on the tribune a few times a year and let his signature do the rest. He thought that at this height his folders would finally be enough to protect him. He had the secrets of almost everyone who stood flanking him on the mausoleum. For decades he had trained himself to believe that fear was a controllable resource. You measured it. You calibrated it. You directed it downward, never upward. Now he discovered a new configuration. What happened when fear began to bounce back from below, reflected in the eyes of people who had once looked at him only from the side? Konstantin Chernenko did not look imposing, not in the traditional sense. He was the type the apparatus had always underestimated. A quiet clerk, a patient functionary, a man whose talent lay in never provoking attention, but in a state glued together by paper. Such men often knew more than any general. Chernenko was one of the very few people who understood not only that the folders existed, but approximately what was inside them. He had not built the system, but he had watched it being built, and he had picked up more than scraps. After General Tisvigun's death, an invisible channel opened between the wounded old friend and the ambitious administrator. Nobody in the corridors heard those conversations. History would reconstruct them from hints, pauses, sudden appointments, and sudden demotions. What matters is the outcome. The photograph from the chairman's safe stopped being a single page in metal darkness and turned into a concept, a story. A hint passed from hand to hand in whispers. It began subtly. At one small meeting, an innocuous joke about family values was accompanied by a glance in his direction that lasted a fraction of a second too long. At another, someone, carefully coached, mistakenly, mentioned the name of his wife in a context where she did not belong. There were no accusations, no direct references. Just light touches like an expert piano player pressing a single key again and again, each time a little harder. Then came the proofs. A tape appeared on his desk for review, supposedly intercepted from foreign radio. On it, distorted by static, he heard a fragment of his wife's voice. Nothing criminal, just a sentence, a laugh, a mention of a meeting he did not know about. The technical department swore the tape had been recorded by their own equipment in the city, not abroad, but someone had repackaged it as an external threat. The message was simple. If they could pass it off as foreign, they could pass it off as anything. Later, during one of his stays in the clinic, a nurse accidentally left a magazine with an inserted photograph on his bedside table. It would have looked harmless to anyone else. A woman in a coat leaving a store, a shopping bag in her hand, the entrance of one of his 4 boutiques in the background. For him, it was an X-ray taken directly of his own heart. The angle, the context, the timing, nothing in that picture was random. Each of these episodes, taken separately, meant little. Together, they formed a pattern he himself would have recognized in any dossier. Someone was carefully applying stress in measured doses. Never too much, never too little. Enough to raise the pressure, enough to disrupt sleep, enough to make the kidneys, already scarred, fight a losing battle. This was the perfection of the system he had invented. There were no arrests, no loud scandals, no plenum of confession. He continued to sign papers, to receive foreign delegations, to deliver short, carefully edited speeches that television turned into proofs of stability. On the screen, he remained an iron, if tired, figure. In reality, every new accidental reminder of his wife's double life turned into a small, controlled heart attack. Doctors noted the crises as hypertensive episodes. They wrote down numbers, pressure measurements, heart rate, blood tests. None of them could write the real formula in their charts. Frequency of humiliations multiplied by the knowledge that you yourself had designed this very method. The ideal crime required no poison, no bullet, no visible violence. It was enough to force the body of a sick man to relive the same emotional catastrophe again and again until a vital organ gave up. In those last months, he had plenty of time to think. The hospital ward, with its filtered air and triple-sealed windows, was as isolated as any prison cell. The radio played marches and news about plans and harvests. The television, when turned on for him, showed smiling pioneers, factories, parades. Only at night did the silence creep in, and with it the question he had spent his life avoiding. How much of what is killing me now did I invent myself? He could ask for folders, of course. He still had the right to demand any file be brought to his bedside. He could have ordered the destruction of evidence, the reassignment of witnesses, the sudden retirement of those who knew too much. But even there, connected to drips and monitors, he knew the truth that no official history would record. The mechanism had grown beyond him. The folders were no longer just in his safe. They were in other safes, in other hands, in other minds. You cannot burn what has already been copied too many times. On February 9th, 1984, the official announcement spoke of heart failure and complications from long-term illness. The words were technically correct. His heart had indeed failed. His illness had indeed been long. Nowhere in the medical report, of course, did anyone write the real diagnosis: death from an overdose of his own technology. It was a perfect political murder precisely because no one needed to murder him directly. The pressure of power, once turned into a weapon aimed at other people's intimate lives, had gradually turned around and pressed on his own weakest point. For decades, he had explained to others that fear was a resource to be managed. In the end, what killed him was not fear itself, but the realization that he had become just another object of management in a system he believed he controlled. In the corridors of the Central Committee, people lowered their voices and spoke of a tragic coincidence, of betrayal by those closest, of the unfairness of fate. They were wrong on all counts. There was nothing coincidental, nothing personal, nothing mystical. What happened to him was simply the most logical conclusion of the equation he had set up. If you build a state where a man's most fragile point is not his ideology, but his reflection in the eyes of his family, you must accept that one day someone will take your own reflection and turn it into a weapon. If you create a technology of stress that can destroy an enemy's health without leaving a trace, you must admit that this technology does not recognize authorship. It will work just as effectively on the engineer as on his targets. So when the morning marches faded and the country waited for the announcement of a new leader, The files in the secret cabinets did not close with him. They remained where they were, heavier than any coffin, calmer than any eulogy. The man who had believed himself to be their master left not only a post and a portrait on the wall, he left a perfected method, proven, tested, of how to quietly kill through shame and stress while keeping hands formally clean. When the funeral wreaths were taken away and the last television address of mourning went off the air, nothing essential in the building on Lubyanka actually changed. The safe that had once held folder number 17 did not close forever, out of respect for the dead. It simply changed owners. Keys passed from one hand to another in short, silent ceremonies. New signatures appeared under old inventories. The mechanism of control, fine-tuned for years, did what such mechanisms always do when their creator disappears. It adapted, shrugging off the loss like a snake shedding skin. Chernenko inherited more than a post and a chair in the Mausoleum Tribune. He inherited an infrastructure of fear that had proven, in the most intimate way, its ability to outlive a single body. He did not need to rebuild anything from scratch. The cameras were already installed. The special cash registers in the lingerie shop still printed their twin receipts. The 7-person non-existent group, reduced and cleansed of the most dangerous witnesses, continued its quiet work under a new curator. Only the caption on the internal report changed, for the attention of the General Secretary. The first weeks after the death were a parade of loyalty. Those who had trembled before the old master now trembled before his successor, insisting that the era has changed. The truth was simpler and colder. Eras do not change when portraits are replaced on the wall. They change when the logic of control changes. Here the logic remained the same. Power belonged to the one who had more folders, and to the one who understood better than others how to use them without ever showing them in public. Chernenko understood this perfectly. He had watched up close how one compromising page could push a man into voluntary retirement, how a handful of receipts could remove a minister, how a carefully measured sequence of humiliations could kill a sick leader without leaving a criminal case. For him, the dead General Secretary was not only a predecessor, he was a case study, a proof of concept that the technology worked at the very highest level. That is why his first instinct was not to destroy folder number 17, but to expand its principle. The physical files were dangerous, yes, but they were also invaluable. They showed in detail how quickly even the strongest people became manageable when their domestic shame was turned into a lever. The lesson for the new master was obvious. Never rely on a single safe again. Multiply the storage, disperse the keys, make sure that no one person, including yourself, could single-handedly erase the most important blackmail narratives. In practice, that meant duplication. Copies of particularly valuable dossiers were quietly moved to other archives, some under the Party Central Committee, some under military counterintelligence, some in provincial special collections that nobody from outside could even request. The names of the 23 figures from folder number 17 traveled along those hidden routes like ghosts. Officially, many of them continued to live, as before, for some time. Unofficially, every step they took was now constrained by the knowledge that multiple hands held the script of their potential destruction. For the 7 officers who had once served the old chairman's private project, the change of era ended badly and quickly. They knew too much about how the system had been born, and too much about the fact that its creator had ended up in his own net. Some died in accidents that were too neatly timed to be accidental. Some were exposed for minor abuses and sent away to places from which nobody returned. A couple were quietly promoted sideways into positions that looked honorable but deprived them of any access to real levers. The system cut off its early nerve endings to make sure the brain remained intact. His widow, Tatiana, lived on without ever fully understanding the mechanics of what had happened. She knew only fragments, rumors, half-phrases, glimpses of discomfort on faces when she entered a room. She never saw the photograph that had once lain on top of folder number 17, never read the annotations in that dry handwriting under the clinical image of her own life. In a strange way, the regime spared her the last circle of humiliation. She remained, until the end, a participant who did not know the full script of the role she had been forced to play. Decades later, when the state changed its emblem and its name, when archives began to open carefully under the new rhetoric of transparency, the ghost of folder number 17 surfaced again. Researchers requested access to materials on the late General Secretary. Commissions were formed, lists compiled. Somewhere in a report, a line appeared about a series of personal files of special sensitivity. By 2007, the country officially proclaimed its intention to confront its past. Laws were passed, committees assembled, slogans minted about never again. On paper, the moment had come for the ghost to step into the light. But when archivists reached for the most dangerous boxes, they found only empty shelves and polite explanations, lost during reorganization, or destroyed in accordance with regulations. Not located. Documents do not simply evaporate in bureaucratic systems. They are either burned, locked away even deeper, or converted into a different form of control. The disappearance of the file was itself an answer. The technology had migrated. Where there had once been film and cardboard, there were now digital profiles, phone logs, cloud backups quietly copied to private servers. The principle remained unchanged. Intimate data as insurance, proximity as a threat, the personal as the ultimate currency of power. The last twist of the story is not about one man, not even about one regime. It is about continuity. The language changed, from counter-revolution to extremism, from deviation from the line of the party to violation of security protocols. The tools changed, from covert cameras in birdhouses to cameras in every pocket, from foreclosed shops to global networks that record every purchase. But the core thesis that folder number 17 once illustrated with lace and ink did not change at all. In any system that believes in control more than it believes in law, the true center of power is not the office, not the title, not even the budget. It is the archive, whatever form it takes in a given century. Power belongs to the one who has more folders, whether they are paper ones in a safe on Lubyanka or encrypted ones on a server farm far away. And as long as that remains true, no change of flags or anthems will be enough to say that the era of folder number 17 is over.